this presentation will try to address a subject which might be that broad, particularly broad, but indeed I will try to minimize my presentation to a specific perspective. As you can see from the layout, I will begin with a classical state of the art by trying to sum up what has been done and written, of course, on the subject of Herodotus and Boiotia so far, just before moving on to a very selective analysis of a few passages in Herodotus' histories. And towards the end of my presentation, I have just included a very few passages by Thucydides, which will not be probably fully addressed, but I thought it would be nice at least to see whether my analysis of Herodotus' presentation of Boiotia can shed some light also on a few characteristics of Thucydides' presentation of the region. So without further ado, I will move on to the first section of my paper that tries, of course, to open a conversation about Boiotia and to be as vast as possible. So you will forgive me if I begin with a few truisms about the region in order to be as clear as possible about the strategy which I adopted. Scholars, of course, are not new to the subject. The subject of Herodotus and Boiotia has been addressed so far by following one or two or three or four perspectives. And the first and mostly represented perspective concerns the relationship between Herodotus and the other sources on the region of Boiotia. And so, for instance, Robert Buck, in a classical book on the history of Boiotia, tried to make sense, for instance, about what Herodotus says about political institutions in Boiotia and what we knew at the time. And you can see this perspective also in recent times, if we only consider the high number of publications about the Croesus epigram and whether this epigram can add something new, not only, of course, about Herodotus' presence in Thebes, but also more in general about whether Herodotus had a literal engagement with this inscription. The second perspective, of course, is the most fascinating one, and the one I am afraid to say I will not be following to the end, because, of course, the Boeotians are normally known as the Medaisers par excellence, and this is, of course, one of the main features that it prevails in Herodotus' books 7 to 9. And as the analysis by Steinbock has shown, the Boeotian and the Theban Medisms played a large part in the Athenian social discourse between the 5th and the 1st centuries BC. And as would have been already clear, for instance, by just recalling the weight of the Medism in the dialogue between the Thebans and the Plataeans in the third book of Thucydides. The third perspective that has been followed by scholars so far in this field concerns the provenance of a specific informant of Herodotus, Tyrsander of Archomenus, who is one out of three named sources in the histories. And this is, of course, not a very relevant piece of information, but I should like to stress that coming from Archomenus in this period is a very delicate point, because Archomenus has a very complex history in Boiotia throughout its whole chronology, and therefore even this piece of information might have come with further implications about what Herodotus might have known about Thebes and about the internal conflicts in the region. The first perspective that has been followed so far, and I will try my best not to prioritize, as I promised, to one of the organizers of the seminar, concerns the longue durée of Herodotus' histories, and more specifically, how Plutarch engages with Herodotus' presentation of the region in his On the Malice of Herodotus. There is now a very clear and short piece on the subject in the section of the website of the Herodotus Helpline, and I need only recall here how delicate and tricky can be Plutarch's perspective on Herodotus, especially when it comes to the contextualization of the information. Plutarch, for instance, draws largely from local historiography, but even Boiotian local historiography seems to have been adapted to the peculiar objectives of this treatise. So all these four threads, I will record them. So medism and informants and evenemential history and later recourse to Herodotus were combined in what has been so far the best contribution on the subject. An essay by Mauro Moggi appeared in 2011, where Mauro Moggi basically claims that there is a growing weight of Thebes in the histories that is reflected, and of course that there is no sympathy towards the historian, towards the region by the historian. And Moggi is, of course, also the author of most of the Boiotian entries in the recent Herodotus Encyclopedia. Behind this and below, of course, this essay, I tried to adopt a different perspective on the representation of the region in Herodotus' histories. And I moved from a very famous definition by Pierre Guillon in his classical book of 1948 on La Béotie antique. So Pierre Guillon distinguished between two areas of the region, an eastern one, where Thebes plays the biggest role, and the western part with Orchomenus. My two Boiotias, however, have a different extension and are also chronologically identified, because before moving on to the next section, I need to clarify how delicate is any discussion about Herodotus' Boiotians if we only consider the history of the region in Herodotus' lifetime, because this region experienced at least three big changes in the broad institutions of the region. And this seems to have had an impact, as I would try to exemplify in Herodotus' presentation of the region and, of course, of its geography. Because Boiotia has very unclear geography when we talk about its internal subdivisions. As you can see from this map taken from the important book published in 2011 by Emery Farinetti, Boiotia is best described as a combination of 14 subregions that the GIS research very clearly identifies on the field. And all these 14 subregions kept for a long time, up to the middle 6th century BC, very distinct identity. The low and very delicate formation of Boiotia can be compared to what early medieval historians define as locality. I quote from a recent collection of essays that I will reference in the next slide. Local societies tend to contain distinctive features that single them out from phenomena at the higher scale. So this map, which is taken from a very recently published book by Roth and Bike, shows how feeble is the border, especially towards the south, towards Attica. And this creates an open question whenever we talk about one of the most important subjects in Herodotus' history is about Boiotius, namely about the status of Plataea and its changing affiliation throughout history. So the region had very unclear geographical borders to the west and to the south. And this unclarity is also confirmed, of course, by the recent MAZI project that has focused on the borders between Attica and Boeotia, and has shown that these borders only became clear towards the middle 5th century BC. So this is the essay which I was referring to before, where the idea of locality is applied to explain the formation of subregions in Europe in the early medieval period. Moving now to our Herodotus, the first passage which I try to analyze in this context comes in a very delicate point of the history of the relationships between Athens and Boeotia. We are just a couple of years after the tremendous defeat by the Boeotians and the Chalcidians of 506 BC, and the Thebans are asking for some revenge, and even the identity of this suppliant is important because the Thebans act as the revengers of the ethnos Boioton, and this is not so immediately clear from the broader context of these chapters from the 5th book, where, as I will show in a few minutes, Herodotus seems to use Thebans and Boeotians very often as overlapping ethnics. I will just read an adapted translation of this passage taken from the Waterfield's translation before concentrating on the keywords of this consultation. So I read, sometime later, the Thebans sent emissaries to Apollo at Delphi because they wanted to take revenge on Athens. The Pythia told them that they would not gain revenge from their own resources and that they should inform that which has many voices of a response and then apply to the nearest. So the emissaries returned home, convened an assembly, and reported the oracle's response to the assembled people. On hearing the emissaries say that they should apply to the nearest, the Thebans said, "Aren't our nearest neighbors the people of Tanagra, Cornea, and Thespiae? But they are always committed fighters and help us in our wars. So why should we apply for helping them to them? It doesn't look as though that is what the oracle meant." So the oracular tale goes on to explain how the Thebans identify these nearest neighbors with the Aeginetans, and this depends on a kinship motif that combines the Thebans and the Aeginetans, and is quite well known already in the early 5th century BC. But what I was more interested in was in the specific identification of the Thebans of these very near neighbors, hoi ankista, with the people from Tanagra, Cornea, and Thespiae. This seems to be in line with the weight of this Homeric debt in the Esagoren Polyuphemon, which is taken from the 2nd book of the Odyssey. And in the 2nd book, this expression refers to the assembly of Ithaca convened by Telemachus. And this debt is a debt that has some weight in our interpretation of the passage, because Polyuphemon can also be can also imply a gifted poet, but in this context implies many-voiced assembly. There is an assembly where people of different thought or possibly different origin coexist. Another important sign seems to be the fact that the Thebans want to have an allié. They convey this assembly that is definitely an early stage of this Boiotian community that is going on in the region, and that may already have its core in Thebes. So this identification of the agoré polyuphemos with the allié explains the weight of these three cities, Tanagra, Koronaia, and Thespiae. Now, whereas we might be sure that Tanagra and Koronaia, I will show them later, are important cities in the history of the region, so is Thespiae, despite the later behavior of the city in the Persian Wars. And this is important because it seems to move our attention to a new criterion according to which the region was finding its union. There is neighborhood. Neighborhood seems to play a large role in the region, especially at this stage. There is between the end of the 6th century BC and the early 5th century BC. This couple of passages from the chapter 81 in Herodotus' 5th book shows at a very close passage the complex use of these ethnics by Herodotus and the very likely overlapping situation of these Thebailoi, who are actually Boeotians. So this passage seems to imply, in my view, the fact that at this stage, the Boeotia that the Thebans have in mind, that at least this tradition accepts, is a very narrow one, is a Boeotia that includes Thespiae, Tanagra, Koronaia, where the Thebans are expected to already have the military control of these communities, but doesn't go much beyond these cities. And this is important because it seems to force our attention to the next chapter, which I will be commenting on in this presentation. There is another much studied chapter of Herodotus' 7th book, namely the chapter with the list of the community that medized. And this list has a very peculiar item when it comes to Boiotia, as the section in bold, which you can read to the left, shows, because this presentation of the Boeotian medizers combines the Thebans as Boeotians, of course, and then says that other Boeotians medized, but the Thespians and the Plataeans. Now, as you can see on this map, the situation of Plataea, if we consider the Boeotia we have just observed in the previous passage, is not that clear, because at this stage, and I will show later a further hint in this direction, there is, in the Second Persian War, Plataea will not be immediately associated with the community of the Boeotians. And this may have to do with the, of course, early development of this list, because Corcella suggested that the list draws on a later Delphic document, and therefore, as its early genesis in possibly 479, and this explains why this Boeotian item will be consisted actually by two sub-items, the Thebans on the one hand, and the other Boeotians on the other hand, as the two Boeotian votes in the Amphictyony expressed. But still, despite this very sensible and bright conclusion, in my view, I think that the idea of placing Plataea in Boiotia can only make sense to a listener and to an audience of the second half of the 5th century BC. This is perfectly in line and understandable when we consider the the classical Boeotian koinon that had its early development after the liberation from Athens, whereas at this stage, Plataea was not completely a Boeotian member and an ally of this early community. Another case in point that seems to show a slight inconsistency in the presentation of the single cities of the region is the same Orchomenus of the Tersander whom I mentioned before. Orchomenus is mentioned at least twice in the books 8 and 9, and in both these chapters, its collocation and its inclusion in the Boeotian community is quite straightforward, as especially the first chapter, which you can see from the 8th book 34, exemplifies. So, as again, then Orchomenion is exactly a place among the Boeotians. And once again, this is perfectly reasonable and understandable in the second half of the 5th century BC, especially since Orchomenus had been possibly the first mover of the classical koinon. On the other hand, we have an important chapter in the first book about the Ionian colonization and the single units that contributed to this migration, where Orchomenus is listed as a very different unit and item from the Thebans, from the Cadmeioi. And the Homeric, of course, depth of this list is explicit because, of course, Cadmeioi or Cadmeiones is the ethnic that we find in Homer, and even the catalog of the ships sets the Orchomenians apart from the rest of the region. And yet this distinction seems to have been quite frequent also up to the second half of the 5th century BC, when even Thucydides, as I will show, was still uncertain as to consider Orchomenus Boeotian city. So there is a little more than the Homeric indefinite in this chapter of Herodotus. And I come now to this chapter, which exemplifies, I believe, quite clearly the existence of these two definitions of Boeotia, two definitions that seem to coexist, where a narrower one finds its focus in Thebes and justifies simplifications where the Boeotians are represented by the Thebans and vice versa, whereas the second broader conception of Boeotia is closer to what we know about the political and geographical horizons of the Boeotian koinon established after 447. Now, this chapter is a chapter about borders, about community also, and diminishing its importance to the status of Plataea will make its way to our knowledge of the Low Archaic Boeotia, and it is important, I believe, to focus our attention to these sections which I selected and presented here in blue. I will just read the translation once again by Waterfield of a section of this long chapter, the one beginning with the Corinthians who are trying to appease the Thebans and the Plataea in 519. So the two sides accepted Corinthian arbitration, and the Corinthians fixed the borders between the territories of Plataea and Thebes. They made it part of the agreement that the Thebans should not put pressure on any Boeotians who did not want to join the Boeotian community. tus me bulomenus es Boiotus telein. Community, yes. After brokering this settlement, the Corinthians left. And as the Athenians were withdrawing, the Boeotians attacked them, but they lost the battle. The Athenians crossed over into Theban territory beyond the border, which the Corinthians had fixed for Plataea, and then went so far as to make the river Asopus the place where Theban territory ended, and that belonging to Plataea and Isiae began. So this chapter seems to be quite clear in explaining the status of Plataea after 519, if we accept this date for this agreement. Therefore, Plataea, as this map shows, is with Isiae southwards of the river Asopus, and Thebes is, of course, northwards. The whole region around the Asopus, the Parasopia, is a region of fluid communities and identities, as even Farinetti showed in her book. But especially, I believe, the place and the collocation of Plataea in Isiae is relevant if we return once again to a very important verb of this chapter. There is telein. This telein is a very difficult one to understand in its full extent. I repeat the translation of this verb from Waterfield. There is any Boeotians who did not want to join the Boeotian community. And this interpretation is, as I stated in the first place, in my mind, right and preferable to other ones that have tried to give to this verb stricter and more fixed meaning. Now, there is a very classical study on the verb teleo, and its reference to telos seems to be straightforward, actually. The telos is indeed a very important word in the history of the Boeotian constitutions. And even though at this stage it is impossible to accept that there already was a fixed Boeotian going on, it is clear, as we have seen from the previous passages, that neighborhood and borders were a frequent token in this arbitration of identity, in this conversation about what constituted Boeotia and what did not constitute Boeotia. So, as Van Beek has shown in an article of 2017, it is impossible to accept the reading of this verb as a fiscal contribution, because what the Thebans were trying to do at this stage was to actually include the territory of Plataea and Isiae in their home city, and if not in the city, in a community that was struggling to find its borders to the south. And we have unpublished bronze tablets for this reason. I could not, of course, reproduce the photographs mentioned by Matthew and Papadarkadas, dated to the last quarter of the 6th century BC, that mention territories possessed by Thebans on the Asopus, dia Asopo. And this tablet seem to confirm the weight of this river, but also the intention with which the will of the Thebans to control this territory, and for this reason the difficulty in accepting the denial by the Plataeans to have their territory forgotten, of course, in this process. So this map, which is taken from Schachter's book and has this very, I'm sorry, I'm not an artist, these very unclear borders in blue and red, tries to represent my understanding of these two Boiotias in Herodotus. On the one hand, we have a narrower Boiotia that was possibly the lower archaic Boiotia, and also the community that in great majority Medized during the Persian Wars. And these are also, as you can see from my decision to include Coronaia, Thespiae, Tanagra, poi anche sta of the literal interpretation given by the Thebans of the oracle in 504. And we have in blue the broader classical Boeotian Quenon of the second half of the Boeotian, of the 5th century BC. That is what Herodotus himself knew while he was working on this on his work. And this seems to be, I believe, also the best context to understand the weight of that verb. The Thebans were struggling to expand this narrower Boeotian ethnos to the south, and for this reason they could not accept that someone who might not want as Boiotus Helpline. And this geographical meaning of tellus, even though it is not recorded yet in the main vocabularies from ancient Greek, lays behind a very famous passage of the Hellenica of Axyrinchus, where we have the verb syunteleo to refer to the syumpoliteia of the Thebans with these communities. It is one of the tele of this classical Boeotian Quenon. And this geographical interpretation was very important in our understanding of the 1st century BC Boeotia, but I believe can also shed light on the previous Herodotian Boeotias. And the role of neighborhood, so central in Herodotus' presentation of the region and of the Theban behavior, is once again confirmed by a local as important, also in chronological terms, as Pindar. I chose these couple of passages which are all not commonly combined, especially the second one from the 1st Isthmian for Melissus of Thebes, because both these chapters seems to give great credit to the geographical meaning of this Amphictyones, which is not so common, of course, in literature. There is a further passage in Herodotus, but most commonly Amphictyones are exactly the people around the Amphictyony of Delphi, whereas this geographical meaning seems to have been quite important in Boeotia, where Pindar, in two very different moments of his production, because the 1st Isthmian dates to the late 70s, whereas the Daphnephorion of the fragment 94 dates to the late 40s, seems to repeat and return on the motif of neighborhood and closeness in order to express and convey the idea of this community that, once again, I'd like to stress, was trying to build a geographical criterion. So still in the 5th century, Thebes looked at its neighboring cities in a radial way, in the absence of clear boundaries of a region. Boeotia, which only slowly found its clear borders with other regions. Even though in 504 other cities separated Thebes from Coronaia, it is possible to suggest that the Thebans were trying to allude to a radial idea of neighborhood as a spatial argument to strengthen their leadership of this primordial league. And I would like now to move to the final chapter of Herodotus, upon which I will comment, even though in a very broader way. So as you can see from this maybe not so clearly distinguishable blue line, there is a very specific field and a specific strip of land that goes eastwards from Thebes to Cornaia, to the south of the lake Copais. And this is important because, of course, if we follow this road, we reach Delphi to the west. And this is important because around this area were the three important sanctuaries of Athena, Itonia, Cornaia, Poseidon at Onchestos, and Athena Lalcomenia at Alalcomeniae, which is possibly between Cornaia and Haliartus. Why are these places important? Because if we follow the myth of Cadmus, as it is also, of course, alluded to by Herodotus in the 5th book, we detect a very specific motif. There is, this is a foundation of a city, Thebes, but as Herodotus makes it clear, it was also the occupation of a region, Boiotia. And as even later and contemporary sources allow us to suggest, Cadmus did not only found Thebes, but was also the shaper, the cultural shaper of an entire region. And even though it is not certain that the etymology that linked Boiotia to Bus was as old as Hellenicus, it is probable that at this stage, the idea was fluent and current that Cadmus had been also the first inhabitant, not only of Thebes, but with these fellows of the entire narrow region. And I say narrow, there is the first Boiotia about which I spoke, because there is a later actually document that takes us, I apologize, quite far from Herodotus, but is important, I believe, in order to understand the two Boiotias that coexist in Herodotus' presentation of the region. And it is a manumission document that comes from a corpus of 15 manumission documents from Cornaia, dated to the first decades of the 2nd century BC. And this document has often puzzled scholars of Hellenistic Boiotia for the reference that you can see in bold to a Boeotian road that should be followed by a priestess. I just read the relevant selection. So after this period, the priestess will assist Philon in all the sacrifices and Echippus in the Atria. Later follow the Boeotian road every year at the Acria and at the Panamia. So the first editor of this inscription thought about a road linking Delphi to Athens, but the sounder option that was first suggested by Schachter and later, and very recently, sorry, defended by Knefler, identifies this Boeotian road with a road linking the three main old Boeotian sanctuaries. And this is important because it takes us back to the importance of this strip, of this very small strip of land that existed already in the late 6th century BC and seems to be behind the Herodotian consultation, therefore, and of the Theban response of this consultation. The Thebans immediately think of this narrow Boiotia, and larger one, the classical one, is only understandable if we consider the later development. There is the development following the Persian Wars. And as I promised, I will not spend many words on Thucydides and Boiotia. I just need to just draw very shortly your attention to these passages from a speech of the Theban Boiotar Pagondas, who gives great weight to the role of neighborhood in his speech to the Boeotians delivered at Delion in 424. And this is an important speech because it is also a speech where it tries to draw on the Boeotian pride. And this also means that we have an internal focus on the closeness and importance of borders for this community even now, even in the second half of the 5th century BC. And as these passages of Thucydides make clear, I believe, in order also to understand the Herodotian presentation, Orchomenus still has a very hybrid identity, as especially the passage from the 4th book makes clear. Thucydides says that Orchomenus was called in the past, previously, proteron, ton minueion, but now Boiotion. It is a Boeotian place. And this change is relevant, I believe, in order to understand what Herodotus does not always do. There is make his audience aware of the changes in the history of the region, of the borders of this region, especially given the complex hybrid borders of Boeotia to the south and to the west. And I therefore come to my conclusion in the hope of not having exceeded a reasonable amount of time. So I try to address here examples of successful neighborhood in Boeotia and of critical neighborhood, as the case of Plataea makes clear, that can only be clear through a careful reading of Herodotus. It has hopefully become obvious that by the 420s, speaking of Boeotia implied defining who was close to Thebes and who was not. This situation sheds light on the actual nature, of course, of Boeotian federalism. That is not the subject of this paper, but mostly about Herodotus' presentation of the region. So Herodotus seems to have worked with a couple, once again, of regions. He's aware of a narrower Boeotia in the first half of the century, that is, during the Persian Wars, where the Thebans can only depend on a selected group of Boeotian cities. But at the same time, he works at a time when Plataea has become, although reluctantly, a member of the region, of the alliance, and even Orchomenus is a stout member of the Boeotian. And I think that this difficulty also explains some details that sometimes are puzzling, as for instance, and I conclude this chapter from the first book, that takes us back to the famous Croesus epigram, of course. And in this chapter, there will be probably no need, given the context, possibly to add to Thebes the one of the Boeotians. And yet I think that that was necessary because it was referring possibly to a stage where Thebes was and wanted to be, at least for some time, the whole Boeotia. And with very selective scholarship that I just display in the hope of, adding some material, I would like to thank you all for your attention.